Assalamu alaikum, everyone, and welcome to another episode of The Scope here on British Muslim TV with me, your host, Waqar Rizvi. You can see the numbers at the bottom of your screen, and throughout this show, we, of course, encourage you to interact with us, send in your comments and even questions if you have any, and we'll try to put those to our guests if they come in time. Now, of course, we are being broadcast live throughout where BMTV is broadcast on satellite, as well as through BMTV's various social media accounts as well, where you can also, of course, send in your comments and questions as well. Now, today's show is an important one, as every show is, following the US President Joe Biden's trip to the Middle East recently, in part, to convince the region to stand against Russia over Ukraine. The Russian President, Vladimir Putin, has traveled to Iran to meet the Iranian and Turkish leaders. And in fact, just before coming on air, images came out of Putin meeting Erdogan. Now, where many would say that Biden possibly failed, and that is arguable, of course, during his trip, coming back, quote unquote, empty-handed, Russia's energy giant has already signed a $40 billion strategic cooperation agreement with Iran's oil company, with more agreements possibly to follow, especially over grain supplies, which, as we know, are currently blocked from Ukraine. Now, though Biden says that America will not allow for Russia and China to fill any vacuum in the Middle East, is the lukewarm response in context to demands for the region to reject Russia an indication that Russia is an important player in the region? I'm going to put that question and others to our esteemed panelists who are joining us live today. We're joined by Dr. Mark Katz, who is an author and professor of government and politics at the Schar School of Policy and Government at George Mason University. And we're also joined by Dr. Deina Abdelkader, who is an author and associate professor and director of peace and conflict studies at the University of Massachusetts Lowell. Deina and Mark, thank you both for taking your time out of your busy schedules to join us today here on The Scope. Mark, I'd like to start with you, if I may. Just that comparison that is being made in many quarters between the Biden trip as well as the Putin trip. Do you think it is fair to say in some ways that Biden may have failed in some regards during his trip?
I'm not sure it really is. I think we'll know in a few weeks. I think that the big thing that Biden wanted from the Saudis and the Emiratis was to increase their oil production. They make these decisions about on a monthly basis. So I have the sense that this trip would not have happened unless there was some agreement about this in place. But we'll have to see how that goes.
Deina, what are your thoughts on that? Because, there's been a lot written, a lot said, of course, about that issue, about Biden and him, just even meeting the Saudi crown prince, right? Especially after the Khashoggi killing, but even beyond that, just the idea of him almost begging, I guess, for energy supplies to increase.
Yes, I mean, the dynamics have been going on for a while. Those trips are just sort of stronger indicators of the real interests that are vested in this process. I wouldn't, be so quick to say Biden failed or he succeeded. We still have to see that and what it brings forth. But, as we all know, the conflict or the protracted conflicts in the region, and having support from Russia and having support from the United States for the warring sides, for example, in Syria, in Yemen, in Libya. So the proxy war has been going on for a while, and those visits kind of top the ongoing proxy war. And the reason is mainly, I think, in my analysis, is the new piece of the puzzle, Ukraine.
Indeed. So let's talk about Ukraine a bit more if we can then, Mark, because on Ukraine, certainly the Americans would want the Middle East to be on their side against Russia, but it isn't that simple for the Middle East, is it? I mean, do you think that the fact that the Middle Eastern countries haven't just fallen to line, for lack of a better phrase, is indicative of how in their minds, their relationship with Russia is actually very important?
It is. In fact, to me, what's remarkable is that every single American ally in the Middle East has good relations with Russia, also with China. And the fact of the matter is that they all see value in having good relations with with Russia, and none of them, except more Turkey than anybody else, is particularly interested in the situation in Ukraine, and is not, is not willing to do anything to annoy the Russians. In fact, if anything, it seems to me that because of the region's dependence on grain from both Ukraine and southern Russia, that the Middle East has a perverse interest in seeing this war end, even if on Russia's terms, as soon as possible, to get this grain flowing. The longer the war goes on and grain supplies are halted, the worse off the Middle East is.
It's interesting dynamics, isn't it, Deina, where at one time we would expect that it would be hard to convince regional countries to normalize relations with Israel, but in fact, it's harder to now get them on the side against Russia at this point. What do you put that down to?
I think. Sorry.
Go ahead, Deina. Go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
I think that basically the war in Ukraine, when it started providing possibilities for kind of a new world order. So it's not something new, as I said before, that Russia has been indirectly sort of fighting the United States, which brings a lot of the Cold War memories back. However, we have to think about a couple of things. China is a new player and on this world stage as opposed to the Cold War. And basically that this is allowing, after a long stalemate, with the Middle Eastern countries, having them go into war and having protracted conflicts, prolonged conflicts over years and years. Now there is, I think, a certain political and economic leverage point, because now, we're seeing the allies on one side or the other, we're seeing some sort of action. And if the leaders are intelligent enough, they would use the same tactics as Abdel Nasser did. And he was quite talented in sort of playing off the superpowers to his own interests.
Mark, let's talk, if we can, about, grain supplies we've already mentioned, but if we can mention energy for a moment, right? We have Europe right now in the middle of a heat wave, and we know that energy supplies are low in Europe in context of what they need. Do you think that behind the scenes there possibly is, in fact, not to the extent of the Middle East, but there is some pressure on the Americans or even the Ukrainians possibly to sort of make friends with Russia in some way so that those energy supplies once again restart?
Well, I think you raise an important issue. I think that there are a lot of governments that would like to see a negotiated settlement to the conflict in Ukraine. Whereas, I think both Russia and Ukraine, I think so far they see this as a existential conflict for both sides, and neither is inclined to quit. Now, as the conflict grinds on, we might get to something of a hurting stalemate, and they might agree to some sort of ceasefire. But right now, I think the two sides are going to continue to fight it out. And I think that the Middle East oil exporters, obviously they benefit from the rise in the price of oil. On the other hand, to the extent that the grain crisis leads to instability in the Middle East, this is bad for all Middle Eastern countries, rich, poor, pro-American, anti-American. It could lead to a crisis throughout the Middle East that neither Russia nor America nor anyone else will be able to readily resolve. That's for sure.
But this will, Deina, have political repercussions. And I keep bringing in Europe because obviously this is affecting them the most because of the current heat wave. I mean, political repercussions are a very big reality, which I'm sure politicians on the continent are keeping an eye on. Do you think that changes their calculus?
I didn't get that, Waqar.
Sure. So for the European politicians specifically, and I know both of you are sitting in the U.S., but I keep bringing that in because Europe is obviously a very important ally for America as well, and has taken an important stance against Russia. But nevertheless, do you think that there will come a point where Europe will say this is becoming too politically difficult for us to keep going, considering the heat wave and the lower energy supplies?
Yes, you already have European countries being very protective of their own self-interests. I mean, not to say that Turkey is obviously European, but you could also, Turkey is a good case study to think about when it's making overtures to Russia, and it's obviously open to China as well. So the dynamics internationally are changing, and obviously, as Europeans, like the United States, run out of sources of power, they will have to face reality. And we've already seen Germany and how the situation in Ukraine sort of put a wedge in its public policy and coming out and saying that what Russia is doing is wrong. So yes, absolutely, it will force countries to unfortunately choose between idealistically speaking of wrong and right in terms of Russia's invasion of Ukraine and obviously realpolitik and real interests.
All right, we're just about to go into to a few minutes break, but we're going to, of course, be back after that break, viewers, with Deina and Mark, and we're going to continue this discussion. And I'm going to talk more specifically then about the specific meetings that these two respective presidents have had and will have. Speaking about Putin more specifically, as I said before coming on air, Putin was just meeting President Erdogan of Turkey. They are set to meet under the Astana umbrella tomorrow. That is Raisi. Erdogan, as well as the Syrian foreign minister, will also be traveling to Iran for that meeting as well. So I'll be back right after this break, viewers. Do stay tuned to us. And of course, please send us in your questions or comments if you have any on the numbers indicated on your screen right now. I'll be back just in a few minutes' time, continuing our discussion with Mark Katz and Deina Abdelkader. Stay tuned for that with us, please. Welcome back, everyone. You're still watching The Scope here on BMTV, and I'm still joined by Mark Katz and Deina Abdelkader, and we continue to discuss Biden and Putin's respective trips to the Middle East. Mark, I wanted to bring you in, and I want to ask you about Biden and his specific meetings, right? So a lot was made of the fist bump, as you know, between President Biden and MBS, Mohammed bin Salman. I don't want to delve into, like postures, etc. But do you think that there is an argument to be made that even in the Saudis' eyes, that the American influence in the region has lessened in some sense? Because there was comparisons, and comparisons are always made between how Trump was welcomed versus how Biden was welcomed.
Certainly there's been a lot of statements about how U.S. influence in the Middle East has been declining. It seems to me, though, that we're at the same position that we were in at the end of the Cold War, basically the same set of allies and adversaries. What was different was the war on terror era, when there was a much greater effort to be influential throughout the Middle East. I think one can argue that America's now returned to kind of a more normal position. And that a lot of the talk about declining American influence is on the part of governments that don't want it to decline. And I think part of the reason why they interact with Russia and China is that they know that the U.S. is at odds with them, and that therefore this will get America's attention. So, obviously America's power or influence has declined from the war on terror era, especially the early part. But I think that the U.S. obviously still remains a power. And I think that the Biden fist bump with the Crown Prince is essentially going back to the American norm of ignoring human rights record in Saudi Arabia. That this is something that previous American presidents didn't discuss very much. Biden did discuss it on the campaign trail. The America became president. now I think Biden is reverting to the American norm.
Yeah. And, you know, within the realpolitik that we may discuss, Dana, is also, and I don't want to ignore the meetings that Biden had in Israel and, of course, the Palestinian territories as well, because at a time when arguably, according to some, you know, the American influence in the region may be declining, nevertheless, a huge win for the Americans were the Abraham Accords, right? And the fact that now the Saudis have allowed Israeli overflights over their airspace. What do you make of that?
Basically, I know, or I think that since the peace agreement with Egypt, you know, several of the Arab countries have come out and sort of cut off their relationships with Egypt. But now they're starting to realize that part of realpolitik is that, you know, what they do in private has to be also done in public. So allowing Israeli flights in the airspace above Saudi Arabia, other concessions from the Emiratis and Kuwaitis, etc. All of those are, you know, indicators that the leaders of those countries are coming to realize and understand what realpolitik really means. So it's not going to better the public image of the state of Israel in those countries. It is not going to help heal the wounds of many sympathizers with the Palestinians. But, you know, it definitely plays a role in kind of normalizing top-to-top relations.
And Mark, obviously, Israel's arch enemy, the Iranians, as I said, and as we know, hosting Putin as well as Erdogan and soon the Syrian foreign minister as well. Do you think that the Iranians have played their cards well in the sense that, you know, they are proving that they are still very much a power to be dealt with in the region, as much as even those Persian Gulf countries and the Israelis may not want?
Yes, I think the Iranians have done pretty well despite the sanctions against them, and I think that obviously Putin is courting them. You know, he met Raisi in Moscow in January, met him just a few weeks ago at the Caspian Summit in Ashgabat. Now he's in Tehran. Putin's put a lot of work into supporting the Iranians, that's for sure. And so I think that you know, I think that the Iranians are sort of making the case that, you know, the U.S. is going to have to do something. The Europeans are going to have to do something. And obviously at a time when, if the Saudis and the Emiratis can't or won't increase their oil production, well, there's a whole source of oil available with regard to Iran. And I think the Europeans in particular, who, you know, they tend to regard Russia as much more of a problem and Iran is not a problem for them, that they're more than willing, I think, to buy Iranian oil. It's the Americans and certain of its Middle Eastern allies who don't want them to. But I would not be surprised if somehow we find a way to permit greater Iranian oil sales, especially if the price of oil goes up. We're talking about the heat wave. Now, eventually, the summer will come to an end. But I've seen predictions that a possible oil price spike in the fall, and I think that at that point, that the Europeans are going to say, we can either help the Americans with Ukraine, with Russia, or with Iran, but not both. And I think that the U.S. is going to have to relent when it comes to Iran.
Dana, one very interesting statement. Sure, sure. Go ahead, Dana. I will let you bring in on that, but I wanted to just add this on, if I may, that the Emiratis recently made a really interesting statement after the Israelis spoke about the fact that they wanted to have, this alliance in the region, a defensive alliance within the region, and the Emiratis said that no, we do not want to have. And I'm, of course, paraphrasing Gargash's words here, but essentially saying that we want to have good relations with the Iranians, which is a bit of a change, isn't it, for the Emiratis as well? Do you think that all of the above are realizing that they also need to make, do better in their relations with the Iranians?
I think that for a while, because things were so stagnant in those conflicts in the region as a whole, that we didn't focus on the amount of influence that Russia and China are having in the region. Um, and therefore, it's easy to see the connection between the sort of overturn towards Iran and trying to make connections again. The important thing to realize is that Russia and China, ideologically speaking, were very successful in political and economic support, uh, and they didn't tag that to real politic interests. They claimed, and therefore they have sort of the leeway there. But in the meantime, the only time that America becomes interested, Biden goes to the Middle East, is when we get crushed for the oil, and so therefore it's very we're not it's very obvious that we're not being altruistic. Uh, they've been building those relationships for a decade at least now, and we just happen to go because we're seeking, like I said, our interests.
Indeed. Mark, I wanted to also talk about Turkey for a moment, if I may, because, Turkey is a NATO member, of course. NATO has been trying to involve itself in resolving the situation in Ukraine. What do you make of the fact that the Turkish president is in Iran right now, willing to meet with Putin and Raisi in such a public way, even though, we know the excuses under the Astana umbrella, but we all know that they're obviously going to be talking about Ukraine, energy, grain, etc.
Well, I think the vision of President Erdogan is that Turkey is a great power, and that that part of the way it operates as a great power is that it interacts with everyone. In other words, that it loses leverage if it's just a junior member of NATO and essentially follows the U.S. lead. That Erdogan gets his influence by being able to swing whatever way he wants, work with anyone else he wants. And that gets other people to, hopefully, in his view, make concessions. Now, of course, it also brought him sanctions when he bought the Russian S-400 air defense missiles. But I think that Erdogan is very much enjoying the position that he is playing, and that whether the U.S. likes his policies or not, his interaction with Putin, it makes it all the more crucial, I think, for Washington to work with him. He simply cannot be ignored, that's for sure. As we saw with regard to the question of Swedish and Finnish accession to NATO, he may have stopped this, from even beginning. He ended up relenting. There are apparently some side payments, and now he's bringing up the issue again that the Turkish Parliament might not actually approve. Clearly he's looking for concessions, and he's not bad at getting them.
Deina, we just have under a minute left, so very briefly, if you can, what do you make of the Turkish role?
The Turkish role, I think that Erdogan is almost like Abdel Nasser because he's playing the powers against each other. It's obvious from his overtures to Russia that he's signaling the U.S. That it is a Middle Eastern power, and he's leveraging himself to gain the most out of the conflict or the semblances of competing between the USA and Russia.
Okay. Well, we'll have to leave it there at that, but we really appreciate both Mark and Deina for taking their time out of the no doubt busy schedules to speak to us here on BMTV's The Scope. We really enjoyed the conversation and, of course, learned a lot, and we're able to contextualize really the visits of both President Putin as well as President Biden to the region. and of course, as I said, and as we discussed, there are competing interests here, aren't there? And we are going to, of course, keep a very close eye on President Putin's continuing trip in Iran and see what comes out of that. And we may very well discuss that as well next week. But viewers, thank you very much for watching this edition of The Scope here on BMTV. Please do send in your comments and questions at any time, of course, and we will, of course, try to have those answered for you as well. Thank you very much for watching this edition, and please, again, do join us next week for another episode of The Scope here on BMTV with me, Waqar Rizvi.